Welcome to World War II, Both Sides of the Wire, the podcast where we lift the lid, bust the myths, and explore the incredible history of the Second World War from the Allied and Axis perspectives. I'm Jesse Alexander, a public historian specializing in the history of the two world wars.
And I am Matthias Strohn, German officer, professor of military studies, and author. In today's episode, we'll take up the story of the Balkan fighting in 1941 and follow the fighting as it spilled into Greece and witnessed dramatic fighting around storied places like Mount Olympus and Thermopylae. Hi Jesse, another week, another podcast. Here we are again. And dear listeners, before we started, we were having a very, very distinguished discussion here about the pronunciation of Thermopylae. That was quite enlightening. So we came with all sorts of different ones. So please let us know what you think the right pronunciation is. I went German first, then ancient Greek, then English. I hope you all know what we're talking about. But that's probably enough on semantics and pronunciation of words. Let's get into it. Let's get stuck into the topic. And I think we probably should do what we always do, I guess, is do a bit of a recap and see how do we end up in Greece in 1941, looking at a German invasion, and the Brits are there as well. And so, again, it's all getting mildly confusing, but we like confusing and confused because that means we can analyze things, and that's what it's all about from both sides of the wire, obviously. So, Jesse, where do we start? Where do we take it from?
Right. If life gives you lemons, make lemonade. If history gives you confusion, try to make some sense of it. That'll be very good. That'll be our philosophy for today. Of course, yes, we are back in the Balkans. We've done a couple of episodes on the Balkan campaign in 1940-41, and here we're kind of carrying along with that. To make a long story short, to get us in the mood for the campaign on the Greek mainland in 1941, that's going to be our focus for this episode. I guess you could say the Italians get things rolling. In 1940, they invade Greece. That doesn't go very well. Germany then decides, okay, we're going to intervene here. The Brits want to support the Greeks, so you have a kind of clash. They all have strategic interests in the Balkans. Italy wants to reestablish its prestige, which fails. The Germans want to cover their southern flank before they invade the Soviet Union. They also want to make sure they can use the resources there. They also don't want the Brits to base any aircraft there, which could threaten their oil supplies, the Germans' oil supplies in Romania. The Brits want to keep up, let's say, their role as defender of democracies in countries that are under attack, because Greece was not a democracy at the time, but countries that are under attack from the Axis. And they also want to protect the Eastern Mediterranean, which is an important lifeline for Britain, access to the Suez Canal. They can continue the war in North Africa, and access to India, the most significant part in many ways of the British Empire. So that's why this region sees the fighting that it does. The first phase, let's say, of the spring 1941 campaign is the Axis invasion of Yugoslavia. We covered that in a previous episode as well. It goes fairly quickly. And actually, it's a combo operation because the planning for the invasion of Yugoslavia on the Axis side was combined with the planning for an invasion of mainland Greece. This is known as Operation Marita. And that is how we get up to this point where Greece in April 1941 is going to get invaded by a combination of Italian and German troops and Bulgarian troops in the end as well. So that is the very minimalistic version of how we end up with a situation on the eve of invasion or invasion beginning in Greece in early April 1941. Matthias, why don't you add some flourishes there to my basics that I've laid out?
I think the basics here are perfectly fine, aren't they? Because if the listeners want to have the real story, well, just go back to the previous podcast. It's all there in all its glory, in all its length. So I think that's absolutely spot on. This is exactly where we need to be. And Greece is a slightly different scenario, you might say, compared to Yugoslavia, because Yugoslavia was an ad hoc campaign. Neither the Italians nor the Germans had really planned for this. Again, we talk about this in the previous episode when we talk about the campaign against Yugoslavia. The war against Greece, of course, is a bit different because Italy had invaded Greece. So there's already a war going on. So from the invasion from Albania that we've also covered. And when you then look at the map and you're now putting on a German hat and you think, okay, we need to sort out this whole muddle that the Italians have got this area and so also the Germans into. Well, you can't really do this without dealing with Greece as well. And so this is why you have this two-pronged attack, you might say, the simultaneous attack on both Yugoslavia and also Greece. And you mentioned it when you were summing up the previous episodes, and we've talked about this in a bit more detail. One of the main reasons for the Germans why this invasion of Greece is now becoming important is the British presence. There's an ever-growing British presence. At the time of the attack on the 6th of April, you're looking at, roughly speaking, 50,000 British troops. So that's a sizable force. And in particular, what the Germans are worried about is not so much the army contingent. The Germans probably less worried about the navy. That's something more for the Italians to worry about. The Germans don't really care about the navy. They don't really have ambitions in the Mediterranean. But it is the air force and the airfields. And for the Germans, the big worry, of course, is the Romanian oil fields because they've set their mind on going east. They need the oil to keep the tanks rolling. And at that stage, roughly speaking, 80% of all German oil comes from the Romanian oil fields. So this is one thing why it's so very important. On the British side, when you look at the British ambition, the oil fields, yes, they do play a role. They are being talked about. But I think it's more about this whole idea, similar to what you had seen in Poland, making sure that Greece as a country can survive, is not taken over by an aggressor, all these things that play a role here. And the general importance of Greece is quite interesting as well, particularly for the British. Again, you talked about this, I think, also in the previous episode. It's Greece is like a pincer, isn't it, pointing towards the Suez Canal. So that's important. It's also interesting when you fast forward to the end of the Second World War and the division of Europe, and the British actually more or less wanting to, in the end, succeeding and making sure that Greece does not become communist, like pretty much the rest of the Balkans, with, you might say, the exception of Yugoslavia, which is a bit of a funny kind of Twitter role that they have during the Cold War. So that's a different story. But again, you can see the importance that Britain puts onto Greece on that. And all this, I think, put together now plays a really, really important role. It makes Greece such an important battlefield. And I think that probably is enough about the general context. Do you think? Shall we go into the military operation, or is there something else that we've forgotten?
No, I don't think we've forgotten anything. We would never forget anything, happen. Matthias. We're two accomplished history guys. We're not gonna forget stuff. Heaven forbid. No, I would just yes. If we're going to get into the operations, I think we've got an idea of what's at stake, right? So far. We do have 50, maybe up to 60,000 British-led troops. It's important to point out, especially for any of our listeners and viewers in Australia and New Zealand, that there's quite a significant contingent of Australians and New Zealanders. Also Maori. There's a Maori, the indigenous people of New Zealand, units involved as well. There's some units from Cyprus that end up in Greece as well. These are all under the command of a British general by the name of Wilson. So Wilson's a name that will probably come up a couple of more times in the episode. He's the guy commanding British forces ground forces in Greece. Now, what are you going to do if you're the Brits and the Greeks? Because initially, Greece was able to defend itself quite well against the Italians. But part of the reason is because they only had one front, the part of the front that's in Albania. Mountains are one of the other big reasons. But now you have the Axis in possession of Yugoslavia. So that opens up part of the Greek-Yugoslav border. Then you also have Bulgaria active on the Axis side, which opens up the entire Greek border, which is quite long. So you have this defensive line that the Greeks built along the border with Bulgaria, primarily called the Metaxas line. It's something like 170 or 180 kilometers long. It's not badly built. It kind of uses some of the same ideas as the Maginot line. That doesn't mean that the Metaxas line is going to be as easily circumvented. So they do have some defenses. The problem is the Greeks don't have enough troops, even with the Brits there, to really defend the entire length of the border properly. So there's a discussion. Are we going to try to still use the Metaxas line for the part of the border that it covers, or are we going to kind of leave it and take up a much shorter line inland, a little bit more, that's more defensible? And Lord knows I'm not good at pronouncing things in Greek. Again, apologies to everybody out there who speaks Greek. But I think this shorter line is called the Haliakmon line, or something along those, something in the ballpark of that, hopefully. Anyway, so you have this debate. What are we going to do? Now there's a massive threat across the entire border. Are we going to shift troops from Albania? Are we going to withdraw out of the Metaxas line? Can you do that if you're the Greek government? Can you take the blow to your prestige to say we're going to abandon some of our territories that we won in the Balkan Wars in 1912-13 and then in World War I? We're just going to abandon it. We're going to abandon the Metaxas line that we spent all this money on in the 1930s because now the military situation is such that it's not realistic to hold that line. Are we going to do all that as Greeks? Are we going to give all that up? And the Brits want them to, but the Greeks just can't bring themselves to. So they try to man the whole line, which means that the Metaxas line facing Bulgaria has less than 50% of the garrison that it should have. Because the Greeks, they're under pressure. They've been fighting now for quite some time against the Italians, a much larger country. So they don't have endless amounts of troops, right? So they got like 70,000 men in the Metaxas line instead of what it should have been, which was about 200,000 men. So that is tricky. It is mountainous territory. Also, the border with Yugoslavia is mountainous. But I mean, you're facing the combined forces of Italy and Bulgaria, and especially Germany. So it's going to be a tricky situation. Let's put it that way.
It very much is, absolutely right. And as you already mentioned, it's quite striking to see the parallels to the Maginot Line here. That is really interesting. And you might say, well, it could have taught them a bit of a lesson, but obviously it didn't, for all the reasons that you already explained. And it's very easy to say, well, they should have just surrendered the territory, but that's easier said than done, isn't it? And whenever you look back in warfare, nations are always unwilling to do that for all sorts of reasons. And this is a very, very good example. Here, of course, it's all about not all about, but to a large degree, also about the port of Thessaloniki, which is very, very important, not only to support the troops that are stationed in the Metaxas line, but in other areas as well. By the way, Jesse pointed out that I kept calling the Metaxa line rather than Metaxas line. And that basically shows you my thinking, because if I'm not mistaken, Metaxa is actually a Greek drink. So my apologies. Yes, of course, it is Metaxas line with an S at the end, not Metaxa line. So it's a defensive line, not a very tasty Greek drink, by the way. So there we are. And all this is coming together, and it's really interesting because you look at this terrain and you look at the restricted road network, for example, that you have. All that should really make it relatively simple to defend Greece. Again, go back to ancient Greek, go back to Thermopylae, go back to the Persians invading. There are these certain choke points. If you hold these, if you defend these, then you're basically holding the enemy. You might not defeat the enemy, but you're holding up the enemy, and that in itself, by gaining time, can change a political or even a military situation. You have some issues and problems within the Greek camp as well. So one of the very senior generals, for example, he becomes known as the defeatist because he said, well, we can't do any of this here. We're going to lose this battle. We don't even know where to defend. The Metaxas line is lost. All the other lines are lost as well. So in a nutshell, well, let's surrender now. Of course, the British have got a very different view. The rest of the Greek government have got a very different view. So you can see, again, there are some sort of interesting tensions that you can find here. And really the big issue that they find at the strategic and also operational level is the fact that Yugoslavia is now lost to the cause, so to speak. I think, again, we talked at length about this in the previous episode, but you mentioned, you look at the Metaxas line, it is there to defend Greek territory against Yugoslavia, against Bulgaria. It doesn't extend towards the border with Yugoslavia because Greece had been on friendly terms with Yugoslavia. They didn't see the need. Very different story with Bulgaria because of the shared history that has been mentioned already. So the moment you then have the situation in Yugoslavia that we talked about in the previous episode, and you have the change of government, you have then the German plans for the invasion. That means and makes it possible for particularly the German forces here to completely outmaneuver the Greek defensive line and advance through Yugoslavia into the soft spot, you might say, the soft side of the Greek defensive. And that is really the problem. And it is interesting that you have a strategic analysis by the British, which I then discuss with the Greeks, and they come to the same conclusion. And they said for Greece and for the defense of Greece, the worst thing that could have happened was exactly what did happen. And that was the fact that you had that coup in Yugoslavia, the political system changed, and that making it possible for the Germans to go through this particular area. So they said it would have been better if Yugoslavia had been, I don't know, let's call it proto-fascist for a better term. So if they'd aligned themselves with Italy and Germany, that would have been a bit more useful because at least they could have prevented the marching through of German troops. The moment, of course, Yugoslavia is at war with Germany and Italy, well, all cards are off, and basically you can do whatever you want. And that's basically exactly what happens. And this is how the Germans then invade. They do attack the Metaxas line as well, but this is mainly to fix the troops. Again, you can compare that a little bit to the Maginot line, where you say, well, you've got a German army group there attacking, not really attacking, but fixing the French troops in the Maginot line so they can't be redeployed. You've got the same here. And the fighting there is actually quite heavy. And when you look at some of the German after-action reports, they tell of very heavy fighting. And also in this area, reasonably high losses because you are engaging an enemy in very well-prepared positions. And it's mainly then with the aid of artillery and also dive bombers that they managed to break this particular defensive line. But the main thrust is coming in, as we now said once or twice, and we can go into more detail in a minute, in the west, outmaneuvering this particular defensive line. So really, right from the beginning, the situation is not looking good for the Greeks, even though you think, as I said, now looking at the map, looking at the terrain, looking at geography, that this is, in inverted commas, an easy one to defend. So a very interesting campaign.
Hey everybody, Jesse here. Just very quickly, I wanted to take a moment to say thank you. And in particular, I wanted to give a shout out to one of our supporters, a new Colonel level supporter, but he wants to remain anonymous. So I'm just going to give a general thanks and a shout out for supporting the podcast to our new anonymous Colonel supporter from the lovely city of, and I hope I'm pronouncing this right, Gdańsk in Poland. So thanks to you, anonymous Colonel from Gdańsk, and we appreciate all our supporters out there. Right, on paper, you have an experienced Greek army. It's not small. It is tired. It is suffering from some form of exhaustion. It is short equipment. It's short, heavy and modern weapons. They're getting Italian weapons that the British have captured in North Africa and then give to the Greeks because they're familiar with them, of course, having fought the Italians and captured some weapons from them over the previous year. So on the other hand, as you say, you have all these mountains and then you have a peninsula that narrows. So in theory, that's a great recipe for delaying anybody who wants to attack you. The problem that we keep seeing here is the Greeks don't want to give up the territory in the northeast, and they don't want to retreat facing the Italians in Albania either. Italy attacked them they managed to more than hold the Italians, actually push the Italians back and occupy some small pieces of Albania. You don't want to give that up, right? It's also an emotional thing. Someone stabs you in the back, you don't want to then gift them what you have fought to deny them for 8 months' time, or however long it was. Yeah, about 8 months, 6 months maybe. So the Greeks are in a real dilemma. And what ends up happening is this British force, 50, 60,000 men, they set up on an interior line. So you have the Greeks holding this long, extended, vulnerable set of lines in Albania, facing the vulnerable part, facing Yugoslavia, where you have, for example, the Struma River Valley, or you have what's known as the Monastir Gap in the mountains, so easier access, and then the Metaxas line. Behind them, by several tens of kilometers, on the shorter line, you have the Brits. But they are not holding a line along the entire peninsula either. So they have an open rear if ever the Greeks collapse. So it's a recipe for disaster. I guess that's easier to say in hindsight. But nonetheless, there are a lot of vulnerabilities in the Greek and British position. And basically, the Germans are good at exploiting these kind of vulnerabilities, right? Although the terrain's difficult, it does kind of play into the Germans' hands. They are more aggressive. They have ways with air power and with concentrated armor of bringing force to bear on certain parts of the Greek line that the Greeks are just not going to be able to resist. Yes, numerous forts in the Metaxas line hold out and inflict casualties, but with the tools the Germans have that the Italians don't have in the same way, they can apply pressure to certain points that it's just not going to happen. The Greek army is not in a position to hold its entire line. That's why the Germans end up breaking through fairly quickly in the north and slicing right through towards this critical port of Thessaloniki, at the time in English usually called Salonika. Now, in the First World War, the Allies were able to hold out and tie down Central Powers troops in Greece around Salonika in the mountains for a long time. In fact, I guess you could say both sides were tying down and holding out the other. And there are some on the British side who are thinking, well, that wouldn't be the worst thing if we could tie down a bunch of German troops and Italians that wouldn't be able to go to North Africa. Right? You have other Brits like General Alan Brooke who say, this makes no sense. Salonika was a disaster in World War I. We shouldn't be spreading out our forces. We should be concentrating them. So there's all this kind of uncertainty on the Allied side. And the Germans end up breaking that uncertainty by breaking through the lines, essentially. But I'll let you take it from there.
Well, I find the fighting for the Metaxas line particularly interesting. I've made the reference now a number of times to the Maginot Line, so we don't have to stress that anymore. But the fighting there itself is really interesting. So what we talked about why the line is there. We talked about the importance of the port, and yes, the Germans bypass it with the main forces, so this defensive line. However, they also go head on and they attack it, and that actually shows the value of defensive lines, even at that particular time. When you say, well, 1941, well, these are all obsolete because, well, it's gone from a bygone era. But actually, when you look at the fighting of the first, well, perhaps 2 days for the Metaxas line, as you already said, the Greeks are able to inflict quite some heavy casualties on the German forces. And there is, for example, a report from the 5th Mountain Division, the German 5th Mountain Division, which says, well, they attack, and then the attack was repulsed in the Rupel Pass despite strongest air support and sustained considerable casualties. And trying to attack this particular fort on the 6th of April, that's the first day of the attack, the Germans practically lose 2 battalions, so they are more or less destroyed. These are quite heavy casualties, and that is only one of, I think it's 24 major fortresses, if I'm not mistaken, that you have there in this Metaxas line. So there is quite a bit of stiff, successful resistance. Nevertheless, the Germans managed to break the line, mainly with, as it said in that report, air and artillery support. And once they're broken through, and this is always the problem, isn't it, with defensive lines? Once you've broken through somewhere, you're then able to outmaneuver the enemy, because the enemy sitting in this defensive line becomes a bit of a lame duck. Look at
it's all or nothing.
Exactly. Look at the Maginot Line. Look at the Atlantic Wall. It's always kind of the same principle, and that's of course exactly what you find here as well. And that is, as you already said, is the main problem that the Greeks and also the British, mainly the Greeks, have at this particular time. It's that they're not as mobile, not as quick as the German forces. I mean, there's always this myth that the German army was a fully motorized army and everyone had a tank and everyone had a car. That is all complete nonsense. Most of these people were still marching into battle as their fathers had done in the First World War and their grandfathers had done in 1871. So there hasn't been really a big shift and change. What you do find, however, is the motorized and mechanized and armored forces that are used as the spearheads. And again, this is a very, very typical, to use that term that I don't like, blitzkrieg style. And these guys were basically pushed through. And it's not really about destroying the enemy forces. It's just about confusing them. It's about defeating them. It's about making enemy defensive line collapse. Because if at all possible, you outmaneuver the enemy and appear in the enemy's rear. And if you do that, you can unhinge a defensive position quite successfully. Again, go back, because we're on this part of the world, go back to Thermopylae and look at Leonidas and the Spartans and the Persians. So that's exactly the same story. So they can only be defeated once the Persians have been led through the mountains and can attack from the rear. So this is the scenario that you find here as well. So now you just wish they'd all read the classics a bit more. That would have been quite useful in many ways. But there we are. This is the underlying issue that you find. And of course, you also have at this stage a particularly German army that is on a moral high, you might say. So far, everything they've done, they've won. And in particular, the big morale boost, of course, is France 1940. If you can defeat the French, well, Greece is not going to stop you, is it? If you can defeat the large French army, which had such a great reputation before 1940, because of the First World War, where the French army really fights extremely heroically, and then it just collapses. And everyone says, okay, we've done this, so we're going to achieve this. And you can just see how confident, particularly the German military at that particular stage is. So there's nothing that they can't achieve. As it says in The Men and Their Magnificent Flying Machines, this great 1960s film, nothing to do with World War II, but there's one scene where Gerd Fröber, the German officer, says there's nothing a German officer can't do. And this is very much the feeling that you have in this army at that particular stage. So morale is on their side as well. And that really does show. And it comes together with this willingness to take risk. And you don't always have to be the fastest and the quickest, because if the others, the Greeks, are marching and you are marching, your relative speeds are the same. And the absolute speed then becomes, I wouldn't say relevant, but is a little bit less important. You can still outthink and outmaneuver the enemy. And at that stage, the Germans are really good at this. And other armies are not as good. And I think that, again, gives them very much the upper hand in this operation that now unfolds. So maybe we now need to look at all these big arrows moving into Greece, which are mainly German arrows, I think. So when you look at the map, you always get these big arrows, don't you? So what's happening? Is that where we're going now? I think...
Sure, we can go there. I think one point about the relative speeds, you also don't have to be faster than your enemy across the whole line, across the whole border. If you are faster than your enemy at one or two key points, then that can be enough to turn the entire battle as well. Not that battles rely exclusively on speed, but speed is quite significant. So if the Germans can get behind the Greeks, which they do, then that changes the whole name of the game. So you can fill in the gaps, but essentially, the Germans managed to break through in this vulnerable area. They managed to slice behind the Metaxas line towards Thessaloniki. This dislocates the whole Greek defense in the eastern part of the border, but it also means that the Greek presence facing the Italians is in danger, because now that there's this gap in kind of the center of the Greek line, the Germans could also turn to the southwest and threaten the rear, essentially, of all those Greek forces facing the Italians in Albania. And it takes time to withdraw them. So speed is not only what's happening on the ground, it's the speed at which your commanders are able to make decisions. And the Greeks are quite reluctant, as I mentioned, to retreat from this Albanian front against the Italians. They only decide to do that, I think, the 15th or 16th of April. By then, essentially, they're pretty much not going to be able to get themselves out, not going to be able to extricate themselves from that situation. In fact, one of the generals in that area, if I'm going to butcher his name, so I apologize to any Greek speakers, but I think his name is Tzolakolu. You see the Ottoman influence with the Olu ending of the name, that the Ottomans were in Greece for many centuries. That's a Turkish name ending. In any case, he decides, well, I'm not going to surrender to the Italians, even though I'm about to be surrounded, because that would be an intolerable blow to our prestige. We stopped the Italians. They didn't beat us. The Germans did. So he takes it upon himself to start talking to local German commanders who are approaching that area, and instead decides to try to surrender to them. So this is the kind of dislocation and problems that happen when your command is not able to make a decision in time and the enemy is moving faster than your decisions can be really made. This initial German advance, which, by the way, partly is thanks to mountain troops who go over peaks that the Greeks didn't really expect the Germans would be able to go over. So there's some, German achievements that are pretty impressive there. This all also puts the British into an impossible position because they're up there defending what they thought was going to be a line where the Greeks could retreat to if necessary. And now they're not able to hold that line because the Germans are moving too swiftly, because the Germans are now threatening to get behind the Brits as well.
And that's absolutely right. I mean, if you keep it simple, because it's always difficult trying to picture these things when you don't have lots of maps and you don't have big, I always say, waving arms in front of big maps. That always sets the scene quite nicely. But so in the east, you've got these attacks onto the Metaxas line, important because of the harbor. But as we now said a number of times, the real attack comes in further to the west. And you might say it's a two-pronged attack. So you've got one axis running down more or less the east coast. So that's towards Mount Olympus. So that is through proper Greek territory right from the beginning. So Mount Olympus is seized on the 15th or 16th of April. They then keep advancing past Larissa and then via Euböe and also the defensive line that you already mentioned at Thermopylae, which is breached on the 24th, if I'm not mistaken, of April, onto Athens, and that is then reached on the 27th of April. At the same time, you've got the pincer coming in further from the west, and that's the one that originally goes through Yugoslavia and then basically a bit to the southwest and then swings down due south and crosses the border in the Monastir area. So right bang in Yugoslavia, you might say, reaches a place called Kozani. Again, my apologies for the Greek pronunciation or non-Greek pronunciation of Greek words on the 17th. And then you've got this pincer that basically divides, and one goes towards Thermopylae as well. So you're now if you're British or Greek, you're now being attacked from two sides in that particular position. And you've got a smaller pincer movement, which is going around all the way to the western coast of Greece, and so crossing at the Patras area onto the Peloponnese. So this peninsula, the last remaining bit, and already there you can see now again troops that have withdrawn, British and Greek troops that have been able to withdraw to that position, are now being squeezed from both sides because you've got that pincer coming in from the west, the northwest, but the main one comes in after Athens has been seized via the Isthmus of Corinth. So you can see again two pincer movement being squeezed. And as you already said, the sheer speed of this German operation going through Yugoslavia and further to the south makes it very difficult for the Greek troops to start withdrawing. because by the 17th, you might say at the very latest, all these troops that haven't been withdrawn from the Albanian front will no longer be able to go anywhere because they're completely cut off. And you have the same then once the German troops have broken through the Metaxas line, and this pincer that swings around the Metaxas line, they are able to encircle relatively large Greek forces in this area as well. So this is all these troops plus other troops, but mainly the troops guarding the Metaxas line, and they basically again become sitting ducks because they can't do anything. So you've got these pockets still of resistance, but they're not in the point of main effort. So they will not decide the outcome of this particular war. And so again, you can see it's a very, very quick and a very swift operation that you can find here. And the Allies do not really have an awful lot to do against this, to counteract this, which again is quite interesting. But we explained some of the reasons for that. Perhaps in many ways, or at least in some ways, one of the biggest issues you find and the biggest problems in this operation for the Germans now is this cooperation with the Italians. So that's not going as well as it should go, and it's particularly when you go to when it comes to seizing Athens as well. So the Germans do not really want to make a big fuss of that because they think, well, you know what, really, we're not really that interested in Greece. We don't really want to cheese off the Greeks too much at this particular stage. So let's be a bit more lenient. The Italian says, no, we need a big victory parade. And so there's a huge debate about this. And it's actually interesting because Keitel, so the senior German field marshal, he actually talks about this, and he says, I'm going to quote, "The quarrel over the troops' victorious entry into Athens was a chapter to itself. Hitler wanted to do it without a special parade to avoid injuring Greek national pride. Mussolini less insisted on a glorious entry into the city for his Italian troops. The Führer yielded to the Italian demand, and together the German and Italian troops marched into Athens. This miserable spectacle, laid on by our gallant ally, must have produced some hollow laughter from the Greeks." So it just oozes contempt, doesn't it, this particular quote? It's quite damning. And this was probably the view, or the view that was shared by, I would argue, probably most of the German soldiers. So they were not particularly impressed by the Italian army at that particular stage in the war. So it's quite interesting. They could see that this is causing more political problems just to heal Mussolini's pride more than anything else. Apart from that, there is no reason why you should be doing this. But there we are. That sums up the relationship probably quite nicely between the Germans and the Italians at that stage. And of course, the Italians felt put down as well. Of course, they've got a bit of a chip on their shoulder because they know that they haven't been able to achieve anything against the Greeks, and then it takes the Germans about a month to win this entire campaign and not only defeat the Greeks but also push the British off the Greek mainland. So you can see this is not good for Italian national pride. So at least, please, let's have a big victory parade in Athens, which Keitel wasn't impressed by, though it's quite interesting as well.
Parades, ultimatums, friendly alliances with occupying troops, these are all part of the dictatorial playbook of favorite things to try to do. Now, although the campaign is quite quick, that doesn't mean it's without its extremely dramatic moments. Of course, we've mentioned a few. You talked about the very heavy fighting around some of the forts. I want to give a shout out here and give some credit where credit's due for very, very tough fighting by the Anzac troops in particular. Not that the Brits don't fight very hard as well in the retreat, but the Anzacs find themselves in a couple of very tricky positions. For example, they make a stand at this famous Thermopylae pass where they hold off the Germans for at least a day, which doesn't sound like much, but the purpose of the Allies now, or the purpose of the British, is to evacuate their own force. And so every day that you can spare is X thousands of troops are going to be able to be evacuated and fight again another day. Now, we know in hindsight that fighting again another day usually doesn't go very well on Crete, for example. But if you're looking at it from the British Commonwealth point of view, in mid-April, okay, this campaign is not savable. We've got to get these 60,000 troops out. We can't afford to lose that kind of expeditionary force. That would be a very, very significant disaster. And Lord knows the Brits have had enough of them up until this stage in the war. So the idea is we want to delay. So that's why there's some tough fighting around Mount Olympus, also by the Greeks, and Thermopylae, and as well as a few other places. I mean, I'm not going to list them all, but the New Zealanders and the Australians really try to delay as much as they can. One of the problems with this whole desperation plan is that the biggest port, well, let's say the two most significant ports now, Thessaloniki, this is under German control, and the port for Athens is called Piraeus. It's a little ways outside the city, and it gets wrecked by German bombing right at the start on like April 7th or something like that. So how are you going to evacuate? It's not as simple as, well, we're going to get them all into Athens, sort of Dunkirk style, and we have a port there, and we can get them all off. Instead, you need these desperate actions by different units in small places to try to evacuate from many smaller towns and villages on the seaside. That's what the British end up doing. In the end, they're able to get off, I think, about 80% or so, if memory serves, more or less, of that expeditionary force. Of course, you're going to leave a lot of your heavy equipment that you would have liked to have had, but better something than nothing. And so, the other tricky thing about the evacuation is it's political, right? The Brits are committed to help Greece, and British commanders and politicians are kind of in discussion with their Greek counterparts, saying, look, we're not going to leave unless you tell us it's okay to leave. And that puts, of course, the British troops in a very tough position. Can you imagine? Your survival or not being a prisoner of war depends on, well, what the Greek government in Athens is going to decide. And they're in the process of losing the war and losing their country. So it's quite an uncertain situation. The Greeks eventually say, yes, okay, all is lost, you can evacuate. And they get most of the troops off. But it ain't easy, to the extent that on April 17th, for example, the Greek prime minister, Chrysis, he commits suicide because of the impact on him of this disaster. So it's obviously more than lines on a map, as we know, but this is like the second or third prominent suicide of the Balkan campaign. It's not something you'd normally think about, but these are absolute tragedies, personally and collectively, for the societies affected by them. And we shouldn't let the low profile of these campaigns in the English-speaking public discussion of World War II obscure that.
Absolutely right. But I always think that this discussion that particularly the British have, or let's say the Commonwealth have with the Greek government, sounds to me a little bit like a lame excuse, to be perfectly honest. And when you look at what Churchill had to write about this at the time, he said, of course, we're only staying there, or we can only stay there if, as you said, if we are invited to stay. But at this stage, when everyone realized that if we're going to stay, we would just cause devastation to the country. I mean, that is just war, isn't it? So you either go there and have devastation, or you don't go there in the first place. So there is a little bit of an interesting interpretation, I would say, but it works to save both perhaps the Greek and face for the Greeks, and in particular, of course, the British / the Commonwealth forces, because the evacuation, as you then say, about 80%, roughly speaking, managed to get off. About 14 to 15,000 are captured by the Germans, and of course, they have to leave quite a bit of heavy equipment behind. The next question is, where do you evacuate them to? Do you take them all the way back to North Africa or somewhere Palestine, or do you keep them somewhere else? Because while the British view, of course, is very different from a central or continental European view, and to them, the whole Mediterranean area is all about the Middle East, the Near East. It's about the Suez Canal, the artery that runs through the Mediterranean and keeps the supply line open. But that, of course, is another discussion, because that then leads to the next episode. You might say the final episode of 1941, which, of course, is Operation Mercury, Operation Merkur. So that's the German invasion or the German attack onto Crete. But that is for another episode, I guess.
Indeed. I will say, as we slowly wrap this episode up on the campaign in mainland Greece, the Brits do come in for some serious criticism here, not only for battlefield performance, but maybe for more sort of strategic and political aspects as well. You kind of referred to that. There are some who say that there was also a British interest, which was not so altruistic, which was, we'll keep the Greeks fighting as long as we can in order to tie up the troops of our enemies, right? Even if, by sending an expeditionary force and helping the Greeks to fight longer, one could say the defeat was predictable and that the British were kind of calculating about that. That is an argument that's brought up some of the time. In addition, there's a bit of a controversy with Australia and the use and involvement of Anzac troops in this campaign, because there's debate about this as well. But there are some who say that there was a miscommunication between the Australian government and the Australian military. And each side thought that the other side took the initiative in saying, yes, we'll allow our troops to go with the Brits and be under British command in this campaign, even though it's quite risky. And there are some who say, well, the Brits weren't exactly 100% innocent in that miscommunication between the Australian politicians and military, and that maybe some Brits told the Australian military that their government was already on board and told the Australian government that their military was already on board, and so on. As far as I know, there is not a universally accepted explanation for all this as to who may have been at fault or why exactly this misunderstanding came about. I'm not saying that the Brits were evil Machiavellian manipulators. I'm just saying that this is a part of the confusion. This is a part of the debate. And this is the type of thing that especially happens when you lose, right? It makes it more difficult for you to keep your coalitions together and to keep your army and politicians, your civil military relations working properly. That I thought was an interesting little aside there about the Australian involvement.
It always is difficult, isn't it? Particularly when you have coalition warfares and different nationalities involved. It is always very, very difficult. What's the Churchill quote? There's only one thing worse than fighting with allies, and that is fighting without. So there we are. That sums it up quite nicely, I find. So what's the consequence of all of this? So this campaign is over relatively quickly. You look at the casualties. Again, on the German side, the casualties are comparatively low, you might say. So they use, roughly speaking, for this operation about just under 700,000 men. So it's quite big, actually, plus another 560,000 on the Italian side, roughly speaking. And when you look at the casualties, it's about 1,100 killed Germans. Italian casualties much higher, about 20,000. And when you compare that to the Greek, about 13,000. So again, the Italians lose more. And you're looking at around 900 British or Commonwealth killed. So that's actually a relatively small number, you might say. But of course, what plays a role is the fact that you've got these roughly 14 to 15,000 Commonwealth personnel that are captured by the Axis troops, mainly the Germans. So with the exception of the Italians that suffer quite highly, and the Greek to a degree, the casualties are again reasonably low, you might say, and similar to what we already said about the Yugoslavian conflict. So this is only the first phase, and then of course there's more happening. And also in Greece, you then have a relatively strong partisan movement later on that affects it. And what you also find, of course, is the occupation itself, and that is an interesting one as well. I mean, without going probably into too much detail. So most of the Greek mainland and also pretty much most of the important islands are actually handed over to the Italians. So they become the occupying force. There are some exceptions to parts of Crete later on after that battle, and for example Lesbos and a few other places under German control, as is the northern part, mainly so Macedonia, mainly because this is where you've got Thessaloniki, so the harbour. That comes under German support, and then you've got Bulgaria occupying the eastern part, so basically that's the Thrace bit and all this. But Italy becomes the main occupying power, and that is interesting if you then fast forward again a little bit, and go into 1943. So by the time that Italy then decides to make peace with the Allies and then actually switches sides. And so then the Germans getting in, taking over, like similar to what they do in Italy itself. That in itself is a very interesting story. How do the Germans disarm the Italians? How do the Germans treat their former brothers in arms? And there are a number of episodes, particularly on some of these islands, where the Germans then land and then commit atrocities and basically just shoot the Italians because they're so angry, annoyed, whatever you want to call it, that's their former partner, who actually got them into Greece in the first place, has now decided to switch sides. So there are a number of these episodes where the Germans then commit atrocities and decide to go around killing Italian soldiers. And as I said, you also have a relatively strong partisan movement in that part of the world as well. So again, the war isn't over. The war continues to be fought here, even though the real fighting, in inverted commas, the real fighting, the conventional fighting, is over very, very quickly.
Yeah, I think occupations are a fascinating topic. And we've talked a little bit about some occupations in Poland, for example, but the Greek one is one. The occupation of Greece is something that we should return to in a future episode. We're out of time for today, but I think that the harshness of the occupation, the suffering of the Greek population, not only due to some massacres, but the general conditions and the starvation that comes to Greece later in the occupation is a story that's really also escapes our attention mostly in other parts of Europe and in other parts of the world, in North America, for example. So I do think that I'll give it a mention here. Greek suffering is not a topic that we know well, but it was very, very severe. And it comes about as a result of this campaign in the spring of 1941. So with that, I think I'll bring this episode to a close. Thank you, viewers and listeners, for being with us. We hope that you learned something new. Let us know what you think in the comments, politely, if you please. And if you liked the episode, and maybe you liked some of the other episodes that you've heard from us as well, you can always help us keep doing this by becoming a supporter of the podcast. You can do that by going to bothsidesofthewire.com and becoming a member of our community. You can get access to exclusive content in our war room that is not on all the other publicly available platforms. And you can get a free trial for that by using the code DEEPDARKWOODS. So we hope to see you there in the war room. In any case, of course, we will see you in the next episode. You've been listening to World War II, Both Sides of the Wire, a Battle Guide production. To support the creation of future episodes, consider joining our dedicated supporter community, where you can enjoy exclusive benefits and connect with like-minded individuals. For more information, please see the show notes, and if you appreciated this episode, please leave a review on your chosen podcast platform. Thank you for listening.
There goes your 30 minutes.
Well, hey, this one I thought would be, 40 to 50. I thought the Yugoslavia one would be maybe 30, and it ended up being whatever.
I don't know how we do this. I've got no idea.